My name is Helen Whitmore. I am 68 years old, a widow, and for most of my life, I worked quietly as a school librarian in a small coastal town in Maine. People often described me as gentle, patient, and maybe even invisible. What they never knew was that silence can be more powerful than any scream. And one morning, my silence saved me from losing everything I had left. When my son married, I stayed silent about the $54 million fortune I inherited from my late husband. Thank God I did, because the very next morning, my daughter-in-law appeared at my door with a notary. The memory of that morning is etched into me as vividly as a scar. Dawn had barely touched the sky. Pale light crept into the corners of my modest living room. Outside, the air still carried the sharpness of the ocean breeze. I remember hearing the knock, 3 sharp taps, brisk, deliberate. When I opened the door, there stood Clara, my son's new wife. She wore an expensive coat draped carelessly over her shoulders, her makeup flawless even at such an early hour. In her manicured hands, she held a thick stack of documents, heavy with expectation. At her side was a man in a gray suit, briefcase in hand, his expression stiff with business. "Good morning, Mother Whitmore," Clara greeted, her voice dipped in sugar but leaving a bitter aftertaste. Her smile was wide, rehearsed, almost predatory. I thought we could take care of some paperwork, just a formality, really. She tilted the stack of papers forward as though she was offering me a bouquet. For a moment, I stood in the doorway, my breath caught in my chest. Yet my face betrayed nothing. I had learned, in years of marriage to Richard, a man both brilliant and shrewd, that calmness unsettles the impatient. Richard had built a business empire from the ground up, and when cancer took him, he left me everything, $54 million, a fortune most people would never dream of. For months after his passing, I wept not for the money but for the absence of his steady hand, his sharp mind, his unwavering presence. The wealth became a shadow I carried, and I decided to keep it hidden, even from my own son. I stepped aside and gestured for Clara and the notary to enter. The house smelled faintly of chamomile from last night's tea. My slippers whispered against the wooden floor as I walked toward the kitchen counter. My fingers brushed the porcelain teapot that Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary. Its smooth surface was cool to the touch, grounding me. I poured tea into delicate cups, the liquid amber against the porcelain. I let the steam rise, filling the room with a calm Clara did not want. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her confidence cracking just slightly. The notary adjusted his tie and glanced at his watch, already impatient. I placed a cup in front of Clara, another before the notary, and finally sat across from them. They believe I will sign. I told myself silently, my eyes fixed on Clara's. They assume an old woman will fold. But they don't know that I have been preparing for this moment my entire life. I learned to fight differently. I do not fight with rage or volume. I fight with silence. I fight with patience. And when I finally choose to speak, my words will carry the weight of steel. Clara's smile wavered as she reached for the cup. Her polished nails clinked against the porcelain. The notary cleared his throat, sliding a pen from his briefcase. The room seemed to shrink, the air heavy with expectation. But I did not reach for the papers. Instead, I wrapped my hands around my own cup, feeling its warmth seep into my palms. For years I had been dismissed, overlooked, considered fragile. In that moment, I felt none of those things. I felt steady. That morning, as I sat across from my daughter-in-law and her notary, I realized something profound. Silence was not my prison. It was my armor. And with that armor, I would not only protect what Richard had entrusted me with, but also reclaim the dignity so many had tried to strip from me. You may wonder now why I would keep such a secret from my only son. Why deny him access to wealth that could transform his life? Perhaps you judge me already, but if you stay with me And if you listen closely, you may come to see that love does not always mean giving. Sometimes it means withholding. Sometimes the truest protection comes in silence, even when silence feels like betrayal. So I invite you to walk with me through this journey. And when you do, ask yourself one question. If you were in my place, would you have signed? Or would you, like me, have chosen silence? And if this story already stirs something in you, if you have ever held back for the sake of love or survival, then stay, listen, and perhaps share your truth. Because our stories, spoken or unspoken, are never really ours alone. The day of my son's wedding should have been one of pride, yet from the moment I walked into that glittering hall, I felt like a guest in a stranger's celebration. The chandelier sparkled above, casting golden light over tables adorned with crystal glasses and cascading flowers. Musicians played soft melodies in the corner. Everything spoke of luxury, of status, of power. But none of it belonged to me. All eyes were fixed on Clara and her family. Her parents swept in like royalty, dressed in designer clothing, their voices commanding attention without raising above a polite volume. They were the kind of people who carried power not just in wealth, but in how they looked at others, as though measuring their worth. Guests swarmed around them, eager to offer congratulations, eager to be seen by them. And me, the mother of the groom, was guided quietly to a table at the very back of the hall. The chair they offered me sat against the wall, half hidden behind a massive arrangement of white lilies. The fragrance was overwhelming, almost suffocating. From where I sat, I could barely glimpse the head table, where Clara and my son glowed under the lights like a crowned prince and princess. I forced a polite smile as strangers filled the chairs beside me, distant relatives of Clara's, business partners of her father. They made small talk about investments, about real estate, about vacation homes on the coast. Their laughter rose and fell like a tide I could not swim in. Not once did anyone ask me about my son, about the years I had raised him, about the sacrifices made so he could stand at that altar. I folded my hands tightly in my lap. My fingers found their way to the silver button sewn inside the lining of my clutch. Richard had stitched it for me years ago when the clasp broke. He had laughed, saying, "It may not look like much, but it will hold things together, just like you always do." That tiny button, cool against my skin, anchored me in the storm of noise. It reminded me that I had once been at the center of something. I had once been the foundation of a family. And now, in this grand room filled with silk dresses and diamond necklaces, I was reduced to a shadow, present but unseen. The speeches began. Toast after toast rose in Clara's honor, her beauty, her accomplishments, her future. My son stood beside her, smiling as though he had been swept into their orbit entirely. When the microphone finally touched his hand, I thought, perhaps he might turn his eyes to me, acknowledge the years behind us, but he lifted his glass and thanked Clara's parents instead, calling them generous, calling them pillars of support. The word struck me like a knife. Pillar. That was what Richard once called me, yet here I was not even mentioned. My name never crossed his lips. I lifted the glass of water before me, my hands trembling slightly. No one noticed. Their eyes were fixed forward on the dazzling lights, the glittering family at the front. For a moment, I wondered if this was what it meant to grow old in silence, to watch the world you built shift its foundation to someone else's name. I had become a placeholder, seated at the edge of a life I once nurtured. As the first dance began, I leaned back in my chair, partly hidden by the flowers. I watched my son twirl his bride beneath the chandeliers. Applause echoed through the room, filling every corner except where I sat. My heart swelled with both pride and sorrow, the two locked in battle until neither could win. I pressed the button once more, whispering silently to Richard in my heart. I used to be the pillar. Now I am just the shadow. No one heard me. But in the quiet, I knew that this silence was not weakness. It was waiting. After the wedding, when I returned to my quiet house, the silence felt heavier than usual. The laughter from the banquet still rang in my ears, but now it clashed with the emptiness of these walls. I slipped off my shoes, set my purse down on the small wooden table by the door, and let my hand brush against the silver button again. Its coldness sparked a memory, and suddenly I was no longer in this house at all. I was back in the past, standing beside Richard in the days when everything we had was small, fragile, and yet somehow enough. We were young then, so young we hardly understood the weight of what we were building. Richard had nothing to offer me except his word, his hands, and his stubborn belief that together we could carve out a life. I remember the first apartment we shared. The walls were thin, the windows drafty, and the rent ate up nearly every penny he earned at the factory. We didn't have furniture, not really. We used stacked crates as tables, sat on cushions on the floor, and cooked simple meals that filled the room with warmth, even when the radiator failed. I would sit on the floor, mending his shirts, while he read aloud from the old books we borrowed from the library. Sometimes the lights flickered, and we would finish by candlelight, laughing at how the shadows made our faces look like characters from another world. Those nights, I didn't feel poor. I felt rich in a way that money could never measure. One evening, when the strain of bills weighed heavy on me, I broke down. I worried aloud that I wasn't strong enough, that maybe we had made a mistake believing love could carry us through. Richard knelt in front of me, his rough hands cradling my face as though I was made of porcelain. His voice was steady, gentle, but firm. "Helen," he said, "you are the pillar. The caught true. I might be the one who works in the factory, but you are the one who holds everything together. You keep the lights burning even when there is no oil in the lamp. You are the reason I get up every morning. Let me carry the rest. I promise. As long as I breathe, you won't have to shoulder it all alone." That moment stayed etched into me more deeply than any wedding vow. To be seen not as fragile or secondary, but as essential, was a gift I never forgot. We had so little then, but we were never without joy. I remember the way Richard would press a kiss to my forehead before heading to work, the smell of coffee lingering in the small kitchen. I remember dancing barefoot in the living room when we finally saved enough to buy a record player. The crackling tunes of Frank Sinatra filled our evenings, and we would sway slowly, pretending the crates were polished furniture and the cracked linoleum was marble. To us, it was a palace. Years later, when Richard began to succeed, first small promotions, then investments that finally bore fruit, he never let go of those early days. He reminded me often, "Never forget where we started, Helen." The real fortune is not in the bank. It's in how we survived with nothing but love. I looked around my house now, decades later. It was filled with things we had earned, things Richard had built for us through his perseverance, but without him, they all felt hollow. The echo of his voice, the memory of his hands steadying me, contrasted painfully with the reality of that wedding night. Me pushed aside, invisible. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one we had chosen together after he got his first real raise. I traced the faint scratches in the wood where Emily had carved her initials as a child, where my son once spilled ink during a school project. So many years of being the center of this family, the glue that held us all. Now I was reduced to a name mentioned in passing during a toast. I closed my eyes, gripping the silver button tightly. In that silence, Richard's words returned to me with startling clarity. "You are the pillar." The pillar, yes, but pillars can also stand alone. They endure storms, carry weight, and remain long after the walls around them have crumbled. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps Richard had left me more than memories. Perhaps he had left me the strength to step out of the shadows and claim my own ground. The morning after the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table, the sunlight pale and cool as it slipped through the curtains. My hands rested on a cup of tea, steam curling upward like a fragile thread between myself and the silence. I had expected exhaustion to overwhelm me, but instead my body was alert, waiting, as though something heavy pressed against the air. That was when the knock came. It was sharp, insistent, almost rehearsed. I opened the door, and there stood Clara, dressed immaculately in a cream suit that looked more like business armor than bridal attire. Beside her stood a man in a tailored jacket, carrying a thick stack of documents. His polished shoes gleamed, and in his hand was a leather folder embossed with gold letters. Clara smiled at me, her lips painted in a perfect shade of red that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, Mother Whitmore," she said smoothly, her voice coated with false sweetness. "We thought it would be best to handle a few practical matters right away." The man nodded stiffly, clearing his throat. "I am a licensed notary, here to witness signatures regarding property and estate arrangements." I stared at them for a moment, letting the words sink in. Estate arrangements. They had wasted no time. Barely hours after the music of their wedding had faded, they were here to draw lines around my life, to box me into papers and ink. Inside, a storm rose, but I did not let it show. Instead, I stepped back calmly and said, "Please come in." "The tea is still hot." They followed me into the kitchen, the notary laying the papers across my table as though marking territory. Clara leaned forward, her perfume sharp and heavy. "It will only take a moment, Helen. Just a signature or two to ensure everything transitions smoothly. After all, we want the best for the family." Her phrasing was careful, but her eyes betrayed urgency. She thought I would fold, that I would obey as silently as I had sat at the back of her wedding. I placed a porcelain cup in front of her, the same set Richard and I had once saved to buy on our 10th anniversary. She did not notice its value. She did not notice my hand linger on the rim. She only tapped her manicured nail against the pen, waiting. My gaze moved to the notary. He shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, though his professionalism held him steady. I could almost hear his thoughts. Sign quickly, keep it efficient, move to the next client. I lowered myself into the chair across from Clara, my hands folded over the table. The silver button Richard had sewn glinted faintly in my palm. It anchored me, steady and cool. I met Clara's expectant stare. My voice was soft, but it carried the weight of years. "Connu," I began, using the endearment deliberately, though it felt foreign in my mouth when addressed to her. "You never once asked me what I wanted, yet here you are, already deciding for me." Her smile faltered, just a flicker, but enough. Silence stretched across the table, heavy and deliberate. I let it linger, filling the room more powerfully than any raised voice could. Clara shifted in her seat. The notary cleared his throat again, this time less confidently. Clara tried to recover, her tone sharper now. "It is not about what you want, Helen. It is about securing the future. Surely you understand that." I sipped my tea, the warmth steadying me. "I do understand," I said gently, "but understanding does not mean surrender." Again, I let the silence stand. It was not passive. It was not weakness. It was a mirror, forcing them to see themselves without my interruption. Clara looked at the notary as though searching for support, but he busied himself with shuffling papers, avoiding her eyes. The balance in the room shifted. I could feel it, subtle, but undeniable. I was no longer the silent figure hidden behind flowers at the wedding. Here, in my own home, I was the one holding the space. Clara's polished confidence cracked, if only for a moment, and I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. I set my cup down carefully. "If there are decisions to be made," I continued, They will be made when I am ready, not when you arrive with a stranger and a stack of papers." Clara exhaled sharply, frustration replacing her practiced sweetness. The notary looked at his watch, clearly regretting the appointment. I rose from the table, gathering the papers into a neat stack. I placed them back in the folder and slid it toward him. "Thank you for your time, sir. But today, there will be no signatures." Clara stood as well, her voice tight, her posture rigid. "You will regret this, Helen." I met her eyes, unblinking. "Perhaps, but regret is better than surrender." For the first time since I had met her, Clara had no response. The silence that followed was mine, and it was victory enough for that morning. After Clara left my kitchen, leaving behind the faint sting of her perfume and the sharper sting of her intentions, I sat for a long time in silence. The house hummed with a low stillness. My heart, though steady, carried a quiet weight. That encounter had unsettled me, not because I was afraid, but because it reminded me how fragile peace can be when others covet what is not theirs. That night, as the world outside fell into darkness, I found myself walking to the far corner of my bedroom. Behind the wardrobe, tucked neatly against the wall, rested an old safe. It had been there for years, silent and patient, holding pieces of my life that I had guarded even from my children. My fingers brushed against its cold metal surface. The combination came back to me slowly, each number carrying the memory of Richard's voice whispering them on the night we first locked it together. My hand trembled slightly as I turned the dial, the clicking sound echoing like a clock ticking through decades of secrets. When the latch finally gave way, I pulled the door open. A wave of faint metallic air brushed my face, carrying with it the smell of old paper and dust. Inside, neatly stacked, were documents, faded photographs, and one envelope resting on top. The envelope was yellowed with age, the edges soft, the handwriting across it instantly recognizable. Richard's hand. I sat down on the floor, the cool wood grounding me as I held the letter. My breath caught in my throat as I broke the seal. The paper crackled softly, fragile as memory. The words revealed themselves slowly, his handwriting firm yet slightly uneven, as though his hand had trembled when he wrote it. "My dearest Helen," it began. The room seemed to still around me. The lamp on my nightstand cast a golden glow across the page, warming the fragile sheet like morning sunlight. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer by your side. I know you, Helen. I know the strength you carry, but also the silence you choose. You have given everything to this family, to me, and to the life we built from nothing. And because of that, there is something I must tell you, something I kept hidden, not out of mistrust, but out of protection." I pressed my fingers against the words, feeling the indent of his pen strokes as though I could touch him through the page. The years of hard work, the long nights, the sacrifices, they were not in vain. Quietly, carefully, I built something more than just a home for us. Investments, shares, and opportunities I never dared speak of until I was sure. What I leave behind for you is not a burden, but a shield. $54 million, Helen, it is yours. Not to spend in fear, not to give away to those who only see you as a means, but to stand tall, to live without bending, to know your worth was never small. My vision blurred. Tears pricked my eyes, falling before I could stop them. The paper blurred for a moment, and I had to pause, inhaling deeply the smell of ink and age. "I trust you, Helen. I trust you to use this fortune not as chains, but as wings. Do not let them take from you what they never earned. Do not let them silence you with demands. This is my last gift, not to ease your life, but to remind you, you were always the pillar. You were always the heart. Stand firm, my love. Stand firm for yourself." The final line was smudged, as though a tear had fallen when he signed it. I folded the letter carefully back into the envelope, pressing it against my chest. The weight of his words was heavier than the fortune itself. He had known me better than anyone, better than even I knew myself. He had seen the silence I carried, and he had given me a voice within his absence. The golden light of the lamp flickered across the walls, and in that moment I felt both grief and resolve. The safe, once only a container of paper and metal, had become a vessel of truth. Richard's voice lingered in my ears. Stand firm. For years I had moved through life as though my sacrifices had left me invisible, as though my worth was measured by how much I gave away. But holding that letter, I realized he had seen it all. He had honored it in the only way he could, by entrusting me with a fortune not for comfort but for dignity. I closed the safe again, the echo of its lock sealing not just money, but memory, protection, and purpose. And as I slid it back against the wall, I whispered to the empty room, "I will, Richard. I will stand." The morning after I discovered Richard's letter, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands. The safe was closed again, the letter tucked back inside, but the words burned steady in my chest. Stand firm. His voice lingered, and I knew I would need it. The phone on the counter vibrated, its sudden hum breaking the silence. Michael's name flashed across the screen. For a moment, I simply stared at it. My son. The boy I had carried, the man I had raised, the one whose wedding had shown me how easily a mother can become invisible. I answered, "Hello, Michael." There was no warmth in his voice, no softness. "Mom, Clara told me what happened yesterday. She said you embarrassed her, made her feel unwelcome, and treated the notary with hostility. Why would you do that?" I closed my eyes. His words were knives wrapped in silk, sharp and smooth. "Michael," I said softly, "I did not embarrass anyone. Your wife arrived unannounced with a notary and papers for me to sign, papers I had never seen before. She expected my signature as though my life were a box to be checked." He sighed sharply. "Mom, Clara was only trying to help. You know she has experience with these things. She wanted to protect our family, to make sure your assets are managed properly. Why can't you trust her?" My hand tightened around the cup, its handle digging into my palm. Trust, Michael, is not a gift you demand. It is something you earn. Clara has not earned it. His voice grew firmer, colder. "So you think she's after your money? Do you think that little of me? That I would stand by while she took advantage of you? You think I wouldn't notice? Mom, you've become suspicious, bitter even. That's not like you." I felt the ache rise in my throat. "Michael," I whispered, "it is not suspicion to guard what your father left behind. It is not bitterness to ask for respect. Your wife arrived with papers, with a stranger, and not once did she ask what I wanted." There was silence for a heartbeat. Then his voice dropped, low and heavy. "You're wrong about her. She loves me. She loves this family. You just can't see it." The tears stung my eyes, but I held them back. My voice was steady, even as my heart cracked. "Michael, I do not doubt her love for you. But love does not mean control. Love does not mean erasing me." The line was quiet for a moment, then his words fell like a stone into deep water. "Whose side do you think I'm on, Mom?" "I'm on hers. I married her. She's my family now. You need to accept that." I swallowed hard. The silence pressed against me, thick and suffocating. For a moment, I heard only the faint static of the line, the emptiness between us, and then I spoke, my voice breaking not with anger, but with sorrow. "Michael, all I ever wanted was for you to stand by me. Just once, to see me not as an obstacle, not as an old woman with a pen in her hand, but as your mother, the one who gave you everything she had, the one who never asked for anything in return." The line was silent again. I waited, holding my breath, hoping for a word, a sigh, a crack in his armor. But there was nothing, only silence. The tears finally slipped down my cheeks, hot and quiet. My son was on the other end of the line, yet he felt farther than he had ever been. That silence spoke louder than any word. It told me where his loyalty lay. It told me what I had lost. Slowly, I pulled the phone from my ear, staring at his name glowing on the screen. My thumb hovered over the button, then pressed. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the hollow ache in my chest. Richard's words returned, steady and unyielding. "Stand firm." I whispered them back into the room, not for him this time, but for myself. The days that followed the phone call with Michael passed in an unsettling quiet. Clara did not bring up the papers again. She never mentioned the notary or the legal forms that she had so confidently placed in front of me. Outwardly, everything appeared calm, but there was something in the way her eyes lingered on me that unsettled me more than her words ever had. Every time she visited, her smile seemed stretched thin, her gaze measuring, weighing me as though I were an account ledger instead of a human being. I noticed it most at the dinner table. She would ask Michael about his work, laugh at his jokes, then glance sideways at me with that same calculating look. She spoke to me, politely, never unkindly, yet the kindness felt hollow, rehearsed, designed to mask her true intent. Each time her eyes swept over me, I felt as though she was searching for cracks, waiting for weakness to show. And yet, strangely, her silence on the matter gave me room. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt I had a space of my own to breathe. The house, once heavy with grief, seemed to loosen its grip on me. Richard's absence would never leave, but the echo of his words, "Stand firm," carried me forward. So I began to walk. At first, it was only around the block, the autumn air sharp in my lungs, my legs stiff from years of disuse. Neighbors passed me with nods and small smiles. Some remembered me from years ago, when Richard and I had hosted barbecues on warm summer evenings. Others looked surprised, as though they had forgotten I existed at all. Each step was difficult at first, but something stirred in me with every corner I turned. My heart, long dulled by sorrow and neglect, began to beat with a quiet determination. Soon walking was not enough. I found myself signing up for a morning art class at the community center. Painting had been something I had always loved but never pursued. Life, with its endless demands, had pushed those desires aside. On the first day, as I dipped a brush into a pool of cobalt blue and laid the color across a blank canvas, I felt both foolish and alive. My hand shook, but my heart steadied. The lines were crooked, the colors unbalanced, but it was mine. For the first time in a long while, I was creating something not for anyone else, but for myself. The women in the class were kind. Most of them were my age, each carrying her own scars, her own unspoken stories. There was Martha, who had lost her husband the year before and painted gardens filled with flowers he used to grow. There was Janet, who never married, and whose canvases bloomed with wild oceans and skies. Their quiet courage reflected something back to me. It told me I was not alone in my grief, nor in my need to begin again. At home, I turned to the garden. The weeds had taken over, choking the roses Richard once tended. My knees ached as I knelt in the dirt, pulling root after stubborn root. But as I worked, I felt the sun warm on my back, the soil crumble between my fingers. It was hard, physical work, and yet with every weed I removed, something inside me cleared as well. Soon small shoots of green began to appear, fragile but determined. I watered them carefully, whispering encouragement the way I once had with Michael when he was small. And as I moved through these simple rituals, walking, painting, gardening, I felt the fog begin to lift. It was as though life, long denied, was seeping back into me. I realized then that standing firm did not mean holding on to the past with clenched fists. It meant finding the courage to build again, piece by piece, day by day. One evening, As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The silver button Richard had sewn for me rested in my palm. I traced its worn edges, remembering his steady hands, his gentle voice. For years, I had clung to this button as proof that I was not forgotten. But as I held it now, I realized something else. Richard had not left me helpless. He had left me with strength. In the quiet of that evening, I whispered to myself, perhaps to stand, I must first learn to live for me. The words were soft, yet they echoed through me like a vow, and for the first time in a long while, I believed them. One evening, after finishing a sketch at the community center, I returned home and sat by the window where the fading light brushed the walls in soft gold. My hand drifted to the drawer of the small wooden chest near my bed, the one that held the things I had carried closest to my heart. There, resting on a piece of faded linen, was the silver button Richard had sewn onto my coat so many years ago. It was worn now, the edges dulled, but its weight in my palm carried the gravity of memory. I could still see him bent over the coat, needle and thread between his fingers, his brow furrowed in concentration. That night had been bitterly cold. I had come home with the button missing, my coat flapping open at the chest. Richard had said nothing at first. He simply found his sewing kit, sat me down, and with quiet determination, began to stitch. As he worked, he glanced up at me, his eyes warm despite the chill in the room. "When there's nothing left," he said, his voice low but steady, "we sew together what remains. That's how we go on, Helen, stitch by stitch." I had laughed then, touched by his seriousness. But now, decades later, those words echoed with a weight I had never understood until this moment. I traced the small cross of thread still holding the button firm, though frayed with time. Richard had always been the one who mended, who steadied, who reminded me that survival was an act of love as much as endurance. Looking at the button, I felt my chest tighten. For so long I had spent my days stitching for others, patching Michael's torn jeans when he was a boy, hemming curtains for the house, mending tablecloths after family dinners. My life had been thread and fabric, fixing and giving, never once asking who would sew for me when I came undone. I turned the button over in my hand and whispered into the quiet, "My whole life I've sewn for others. When will I stitch something for myself?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and unresolved. It was not bitterness I felt, but a realization that somewhere along the way I had forgotten my own fabric, my own unraveling seams. The button, once a symbol of duty and devotion, became something new in that moment. I saw not just the threads Richard had woven, but the possibility of weaving for myself. To take the scraps of what remained, grief, solitude, memories, and piece them into something whole, not for anyone else, but for me. I slipped the button into my pocket and carried it outside into the garden. The earth was cool beneath my fingers as I pressed the button into the soil beside the roses I had begun to tend. It was not a burial, but a planting. A way of saying that from what was old, from what had endured, something new might bloom. As the twilight deepened, I stood in the yard and felt the night air brush against my skin. For years I had worn that button like armor, proof that Richard had seen me, held me, cared for me. Now it was more than memory. It was a seed of renewal. In the silence, I heard Richard's voice again, steady as ever. "When there's nothing left, we sew together what remains." Only this time I answered him. "Yes, Richard, but now I'll sew for me." The words were soft, but they rose within me like a vow. The silver button was no longer just a keepsake of survival. It had become an anchor of resilience, a reminder that endurance is not the same as erasure. I could hold the pieces of myself together, not merely for others, but for the life still waiting to be lived. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt lighter than I had in years. The button's absence from the drawer did not leave me empty. It left me free. The morning after I planted the silver button in the soil beside the roses, I returned to my room and opened the drawer of the wooden chest once again. My fingers brushed over the velvet box that had held my most precious keepsakes. I lifted the lid slowly, as though disturbing something sacred. Inside lay the letter Richard had written, its edges yellowed and fragile, and next to it the space where the button had once rested. I held the letter carefully, breathing in the faint scent of old paper. Richard's handwriting, uneven and slightly trembling, was still strong enough to carry his voice across the years. His words had told me to stand tall, to use what he left not as a shield against fear, but as a foundation for living. I had carried that letter like a lifeline, clutching it in the darkest moments, whispering to myself that I was not alone. Beside it now, I placed the button. I had dug it out of the earth earlier, wiping away the dirt until it shone faintly once more. My hand lingered on it before I set it gently into the velvet next to Richard's words. The two objects, paper and silver, seemed to speak to one another as if bound by the same promise of survival and love. For years, I had hidden behind these relics, pressing them to my chest when the world felt too heavy. They had been my shelter. But as I looked at them now, I realized that clinging to the past had become its own kind of prison. I whispered softly, "I don't need to hide behind you anymore." The words surprised me. They rose not from sorrow, but from a place of calm. My voice trembled, but only slightly, like a thread loosening after being pulled too tight. I leaned back, my hands resting on the chest, and let the silence of the room wash over me. It struck me that this was not an ending, but a rebirth. For the first time since Richard's passing, I felt that I was stepping out from the shadow of grief. I could honor him without being bound by him. His love was stitched into me, not into the objects I kept. The button and the letter were symbols. Yes, but they were not the sum of who I was. I closed the box with deliberate care, the soft click of the lid like the sealing of a chapter. My breath steadied, deeper now, fuller. It was as though I had made room inside myself for something new, something waiting patiently for me to notice it. I rose and walked to the mirror. For years, I had avoided my reflection, unable to face the lines time had drawn across my face, the grief etched into my eyes. But when I looked now, I saw something else. Tiredness, yes, but also endurance. And beneath that, a spark. The faintest glimmer of a woman still capable of living, of creating, of loving herself. I smoothed my blouse and whispered again, this time to my reflection, "I am not just what I lost. I am still here." The words carried more strength than I expected. They did not erase the ache, but they softened it, reshaping it into something I could carry without collapsing beneath it. Outside the window, the garden stirred in the morning breeze. The roses swayed gently, and where I had pressed the button into the soil the night before, I imagined roots beginning to take hold, unseen but alive. Life always found a way forward, even through brokenness. I realized that was what Richard had meant all along. With the velvet box tucked safely away, I walked into the kitchen, brewed a fresh pot of tea, and let the steam rise into the quiet house. Each movement felt like a small act of choosing not to surrender to despair, choosing not to define myself only as a widow or as a mother overshadowed by her son's wife. I was Helen Whitmore, still breathing, still capable of becoming. That morning, I stepped outside with my tea and stood on the porch. The sun was lifting slowly, painting the sky in hues of amber and pale blue. I felt the warmth settle over me, and for the first time in a long time, I welcomed it not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as a promise of what I might still find. I whispered once more, a vow this time, "Richard, I will carry you with me." but I will also walk forward for me. The first real crack appeared on a windy Thursday when Michael and Clara stopped by unannounced. I was in the garden pruning roses. From the kitchen window, I heard the back door open and their voices move across the tile. I paused by the trellis, hidden from sight, the kettle beginning to hum inside. Clara spoke first, brisk and bright. "This place is far too big for her. She rattles around in it like a marble in a shoebox. We should sell while the market is high." Michael lowered his voice. "It is. Her home." "Exactly," she said. "The lot alone would fetch a premium. We could move her into a tasteful senior community. She does not need this much space." My fingers found the velvet box in my apron pocket. The silver button rested there beside Richard's letter. I stayed very still and listened. "She will never agree if we ask bluntly," Clara continued. "You saw what happened with the notary. We frame it as safety and convenience. Once she signs a listing agreement, the rest will be easy." Michael hesitated. "I do not want to pressure her," he said. "She has been different these past weeks, calmer. I cannot read her." "That is why we act," Clara replied. "Downsizing will be a relief. Think of the headaches we avoid. Taxes, maintenance, insurance. I already pulled comps." I pictured her manicured fingers skating over my table. The kettle whistled. I let it sing for a breath before walking inside. The door creaked. Both of them turned. I met their faces with the quiet I had been cultivating. "Mom," Michael said, startled. "We were just about to make tea." "I have it," I answered, moving past them. I set 3 cups out and placed the sugar bowl in the center. My hands were steady. Clara offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. "What a lovely afternoon," she said. "We were admiring the light in your kitchen." "It is kind," I replied. "It shows everything as it is." We sat. The stillness pressed against their earlier plans. I poured tea and did not ask what they had been discussing. I did not need to. The walls had already told me. Clara cleared her throat. "Michael and I were thinking about ways to make things easier for you. The house must be a lot to manage." "It is a good house," I said. "It has held us in storms." I stirred my tea. "And I am capable of choosing where I live." Michael reached for the sugar, but found none. I had not filled the bowl. He looked at me, then at Clara, unsure where the conversation belonged. I let the pause widen. In that open space, their assumptions began to sound foolish even to themselves. Clara tried again. "Of course. We only meant options. Markets move quickly. If we positioned the property properly, we could secure a strong offer." "Possibly," I said, laying down the spoon, "but timing is everything. Sometimes the strongest move is to wait." The notary's visit flickered across Clara's face. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Michael studied the rim of his cup. In another life, I would have defended myself with explanations. I would have tried to win them with reasons, with softness. Now I understood restraint. Power does not always announce itself. It sits quietly and lets the other side feel the weight of its own hurry. I set the kettle back on the flame. "Would either of you like more tea?" I asked. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. "No, Mom," he said. "We are fine." Clara gathered her papers. "We should be going," she murmured. At the door, I touched Michael's sleeve. "Drive safely," I said. Then I smiled, a choice. The smile said I had heard everything and feared nothing. It said the house was not the only thing built to stand. When the door clicked shut, I leaned against the counter and felt clarity settle inside me. The roses outside nodded gently. I was not cornered. I was not small. Their plan had met a wall they had not measured, and the wall was me. The first time Michael came alone was on a quiet Saturday afternoon. The air was warm and the light poured across the wooden floors of the studio I had set up by the window. brushes fanned out in jars, water cups stained with streaks of blue and green, and a half-finished canvas rested on the easel. It was a landscape I had started in class, something simple. Rolling hills under a sky that seemed to breathe. When the doorbell rang, I set the brush aside and wiped my hands on a cloth. Opening the door, I saw my son standing there with his shoulders drawn tight, his eyes darting past me as if expecting Clara to appear from the corners. But she was not there. For once, it was only him. "Mom," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I thought I'd stop by." "Come in," I answered, stepping aside. He walked into the living room and paused when he saw the studio space. His gaze settled on the easel, the jars, the faint smell of paint. I watched him soften, confusion flickering across his face. He'd grown up in a house where his father fixed engines and I patched clothes. The sight of me surrounded by colors and brushes was foreign. "You're painting," he murmured. "Yes," I said. "I've been learning. It feels good to put my hands to something that does not need mending, only shaping." He approached the canvas and leaned in. "It's beautiful," he whispered, as though surprised I could create something beyond casseroles and folded laundry. I studied him as he studied my work. The lines of his jaw were Richard's, but the worry that furrowed his brow was his own. He looked tired. "Michael," I said softly, "when you were a boy, you used to sit on that porch with your father and me. You would tell me you wanted to be strong, but not hard. Do you remember?" He looked down. "I don't know if I do." "I do," I said, "and I want you to hear something. Don't let anyone teach you to forget your own blood. It is easy to be persuaded that family is an obstacle, especially when voices are loud and insistent. But blood is not something to be bartered. It binds whether we honor it or not." His hands clenched at his sides. He swallowed. The silence in the room was thick. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said finally, almost to himself. "Clara kept saying you were fragile, that you needed guidance. I thought—" "You thought she was protecting me," I finished for him. "But ask yourself, Michael, who was she? Really protecting?" He flinched at the question. I did not press. The truth was a seed. It would grow in its own time. I walked back to the easel and dipped my brush in the water, letting the color bleed out slowly. "When your father was alive," I said, "he used to call me his pillar. Not because I was grand or unshakable, but because I stood quietly through all the storms. You were raised in that strength. It still belongs to you." Michael lowered himself into a chair. His eyes were damp, though he tried to mask it. "I've been blind," he whispered. "I let her words steer me. I doubted my own mother." I turned to him. "Doubt is human. What matters is what you do when you see clearly again." He nodded, unable to speak. The air carried the faint scent of turpentine and roses drifting in from the garden. He sat there, silent, as though measuring every mistake against the weight of love he had taken for granted. I placed the brush down and walked to him, resting my hand gently on his shoulder. He looked up at me then, and for the first time in many months, I saw not the dutiful husband trying to keep peace, but the boy who once ran barefoot across our yard, laughing, his heart unburdened. In that moment, I said nothing more. Words had already done their work. Silence was heavier, truer, and he sat there, grappling with himself, realizing at last the cruelty he had allowed to grow in our home. I returned to my easel, dipped the brush in fresh paint, and let the colors stretch across the canvas. Behind me, Michael stayed still, his breathing deep, his heart breaking open in the quiet. It was not victory I felt, but a beginning. The morning was cool and golden, the kind of morning that seems to carry a secret promise. I decided to walk to the park near my neighborhood, the one Richard and I used to visit when Michael was a child. My steps were steady, unhurried, and the gravel path crunched lightly beneath my shoes. The air smelled of fresh grass and damp earth, mingled with the sweetness of blooming lilacs lining the edge of the path. The wind picked up as I walked beneath the trees, and strands of my silver hair lifted, catching the sunlight like threads of silk. For years I had hidden behind duty, behind grief, behind the walls of my own house. That morning, though, I felt the weight of those walls loosen. I tilted my face toward the breeze and let it rush across my cheeks, cool and alive. Near the swings, children laughed, their voices ringing like bells. I stopped to watch them. One boy kicked his legs high, soaring, while a girl in a red dress ran after a bright balloon, her mother calling after her. Their laughter struck me, not as something foreign, but as something I had almost forgotten belonged to me once. Richard and I used to sit on a bench just a few steps from here, with Michael perched on his father's shoulders, shrieking with joy as Richard spun him in circles. A sound rose in my chest, half sigh, half laugh, as the memory brushed against me. It was not sorrowful. It was tender, like the turning of an old page that still holds its color. I walked toward the bench, the same one we had sat on long ago, and lowered myself onto it. The wood was warm under the sun, worn smooth by years of visitors. As I sat there, I felt something stirring inside, a quiet realization forming like the dawn. For so long, I had lived as if my life ended with Richard's, as if widowhood was not just the closing of one chapter, but the whole book slamming shut. But here I was, breathing, feeling the breeze, watching children grow under the same sky that once held my son's laughter. My heart whispered, almost aloud, "I am still alive." The words carried through me, resonating in every corner of my being. I am still alive, and I have the right to choose how I live. Not as a shadow in my son's home, not as a woman reduced to a signature on a paper, but as Helen Whitmore, who once built a life out of nothing, who once stood beside a man she loved and helped him dream bigger than hunger and bills. That strength was still mine. The wind gusted again, scattering leaves across the path. I watched a little girl chase them, her giggles echoing. I envied her freedom, but then I realized I was free too. Not in the way a child is, but in the way someone who has survived storms can be. I had endured loss, betrayal, and loneliness, and yet I remained, steady, breathing, unbroken. I placed my hands on my lap, feeling the lines of my skin, the years etched into them. Every wrinkle was proof that I had lived, that I had fought through days others might not have survived. Instead of shame, I felt pride. A jogger passed me and offered a polite nod. I smiled back, genuinely realizing I had not done that in a long time. For a fleeting second, I imagined Richard beside me, smiling too, proud that I had finally lifted my chin. I closed my eyes and let myself believe he was there, whispering what he always did. "Stand tall, Helen. The world is still yours." When I opened my eyes, the sky stretched wide above, clear and endless. My chest felt lighter, as though I had set down a burden I had carried far too long. And in that moment, I understood. Healing did not come in grand gestures. It came in quiet mornings, in children's laughter, in the wind playing through silver hair. It came in choosing simply to live again. The day Clara came again, the house was quiet. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the dining table. I had set out the teapot Richard and I had bought on our first trip abroad. Its porcelain gleamed softly, a small reminder of gentler times. Clara sat across from me, her posture straight but her eyes restless. She began with pleasantries, the kind she thought sounded polite. Compliments about the garden, questions about whether I had been keeping busy. But beneath her voice lay a sharp edge, like a blade hidden under, velvet. And soon enough, she leaned forward, her words slipping out with a false sweetness. "Helen, you know this house is much too big for you. It must be exhausting to maintain. Michael and I have been talking. Selling it could bring in so much, and you wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore. You deserve rest." I poured the tea slowly, watching the amber liquid swirl into the cups. The steam rose, fragrant, carrying hints of chamomile. I did not answer. My silence was not from weakness, nor from confusion. It was chosen. I let the pause stretch between us, heavy and unbroken, until she shifted in her seat. Clara smiled, but her smile faltered when I met her gaze. I had learned that sometimes silence is more powerful than 1,000 words. It demands that others confront themselves without offering them the comfort of response. So I sat still, my hands folded neatly on the table, as if the conversation had never happened. Her voice wavered slightly as she tried again. "You know, we could find you a lovely apartment, something more manageable. You wouldn't feel so alone, and Michael and I could handle the rest. It would really be for the best." I lifted the teacup and took a calm sip, savoring the warmth as it spread through me. My face betrayed no anger, no fear, only steadiness. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder in the quiet, each second marking her growing unease. Inside, I felt a shift, a strength born from all the quiet battles I had endured. I remembered Richard's words in his letter, the weight of the silver button in my hand, the mornings in the park when I rediscovered my right to live. Clara's attempts no longer pierced me. They slid off like rain against stone. Her fingers tapped the table nervously. The confident woman who once strode into my house with a notary now seemed smaller, less certain. She searched my face for a crack, for a plea, for any sign of surrender. But I offered none. The silence thickened, pressing in until she finally broke it with a forced laugh. "Of course, I don't mean to pressure you. I only want what's best for the family." I set my teacup down gently. The porcelain touched the saucer with a soft chime, a sound far louder in that heavy moment. I leaned back slightly, still saying nothing. Clara's eyes darted away and she shifted again, as if the chair itself had grown uncomfortable. In that stillness, I realized the balance of power had changed. She had once believed my quiet was ignorance or weakness. Now she understood. It was deliberate. It was strength. It was the refusal to be moved by manipulation. The room seemed to close in on her. She fidgeted, searching for another angle, but every attempt died in her throat under the weight of my silence. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her own cup, then quickly set it down without drinking. At last she rose, smoothing her dress, her composure fraying at the edges. "I should go. I have errands," she muttered. The words lacked their usual confidence. She glanced at me one last time, but I offered only a serene smile, the kind that says more than words ever could. When the door closed behind her, the house grew peaceful again. I sat there, listening to the steady beat of the clock, the faint rustle of leaves outside. My silence had spoken louder than any speech. It told Clara, without a single word, that I could not be bought, coerced, or diminished. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of that truth. I was no longer a shadow at the edge of my own life. I had reclaimed my place in it, not by shouting, but by standing tall in the quiet. Michael came to see me one evening when the sky outside was turning the color of burnt amber, the kind of light that makes every shadow stretch long and thin. He knocked softly, almost as if he was afraid of what waited behind the door. When I opened it, I saw a weight on his face I had not seen since he was a boy, struggling to confess some childhood mistake. He stepped inside, shoulders slumped, and for a long moment we simply stood there in silence. I could feel his shame radiating through the quiet. "Mom," he began, his voice low, rough at the edges. "I think I finally understand. I've been blind. Clara, she isn't the woman I thought she was." His words trembled, but I heard the sincerity in them, as though each syllable carried the burden of guilt he'd been carrying for months. I motioned him toward the living room, where the lamplight painted the walls with a soft golden hue. I had left one of my half-finished canvases on the easel. He glanced at it, then looked quickly away, as though reminded that I had built a life of quiet dignity he had almost allowed Clara to destroy. He sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles pale. "She's been pushing me, Mother, to take what isn't ours, to sell this house, to control everything you own. And I let myself believe her lies, because it was easier than facing the truth. I let her convince me that you were stubborn, that you didn't know what was best for yourself." His voice cracked, and he shook his head. "But today I saw her speaking to a lawyer behind my back. She wasn't even subtle about it. She wanted to make sure I was ready to pressure you. I realized then that she never cared about me, only about what you had." I listened quietly, my heart aching for him, my son, caught in a web spun by charm and manipulation. A part of me wanted to rage, to remind him of the nights I had cried into my pillow, the days I had been left alone at family gatherings, the times his silence had cut deeper than Clara's words ever could. But instead, I breathed deeply and let the years of pain soften into something else, compassion. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. He looked at me then, eyes full of remorse, searching for some sign that he was not beyond forgiveness. "Michael," I said softly, "every life is full of mistakes. What matters most is whether we learn from them before it's too late." Tears welled in his eyes, and he turned his head slightly, ashamed to meet my gaze. "I hurt you, Mom. I stood with her when I should have stood with you. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for that." I squeezed his shoulder, my own voice steady. "I have already forgiven you. I never wanted to lose you, Michael. But forgiveness does not mean blindness. I will not allow Clara to cross the line again. She has shown me who she is, and now she has shown you too." The words lingered in the air, heavy but clear. This was the boundary I had chosen. My love for my son would remain, unconditional and enduring. But my tolerance for manipulation, for greed disguised as care, had ended. Michael leaned forward, pressing his hands to his face. His shoulders shook, not with rage but with release, as though years of denial were breaking free all at once. "I don't know what to do now," he admitted. "You begin," I told him, "by being the man your father believed you could be, by protecting, not destroying, by remembering that family is not about possession, but about loyalty, and by standing with me, not against me." He nodded slowly, as if etching my words into his heart. A fragile peace filled the room, the kind that follows a storm when the air is still heavy with rain, but the sky is already beginning to clear. I thought of Richard then, of the promise he had made to me in our youth. He had called me his pillar, his anchor. Now I realized that our son needed me to be that pillar too, even after Richard was gone. Forgiveness was not weakness, it was strength. The kind that allowed us to let go of bitterness while still guarding the boundaries that kept us whole. Michael finally raised his eyes to mine. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." I smiled faintly. "It was never an option. You are my son. Nothing can change that. But understand this. Clara may still try to reach for what does not belong to her. Next time, you will need to choose where you stand, not with silence, but with action." The firelight flickered in the hearth, and for a moment we sat together, not mother and son estranged, but two souls mending the fracture between them. It was not a perfect repair, the cracks remained, but the light found its way through the broken places, making them shine in their own strange beauty. That night, I knew the healing had begun. Forgiveness had been offered, and the line had been drawn. Clara would never again mistake my silence for surrender, nor my son's loyalty for hers to command. The house felt lighter, as if the walls themselves breathed easier, knowing that love, though tested, had not been destroyed. The kitchen was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that feels like a soft blanket draped gently over the room. The last light of the day spilled through the window, golden and warm, touching the edges of the table where I sat. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and old wood, scents that had carried me through years of waiting, of hoping, of surviving. I rested my hands on the table, fingers brushing the cool surface, and let my eyes drift toward the framed photograph of Richard on the shelf. His smile, calm, reassuring, still carried the strength that had once held our little world together. I whispered to him, though my voice was barely louder than the sound of the wind tapping against the glass. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes, silence is the strongest voice we have. As the words left my lips, I felt the truth of them settle deep inside me. For so long, I had confused silence with invisibility, with erasure. I had believed that by staying quiet, I was being diminished. But now I knew better. My silence had not been surrender. It had been my power, my shield, and my way of choosing dignity over noise. The photograph seemed to glow in the fading light, and for the first time in years, I felt Richard's presence not as a shadow of loss, but as a companion in resilience. The silver button he once stitched for me rested in its velvet box nearby, a small symbol of both endurance and rebirth. I touched it gently, not with sorrow this time, but with gratitude. Every stitch, every memory, every silent moment had carried me here, to a place where my voice no longer needed to shout to be heard. In the stillness of that kitchen, I felt something inside me unlock. I realized that healing is not a dramatic triumph. It is the quiet acceptance of who you are and the decision to keep moving forward. I breathed in deeply, filling my lungs with the evening air, and I smiled, not because everything had been fixed, but because I had chosen peace. And now, to you who have walked with me through this story, I want to pause before we part. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee resting by your side? Or is it a late night when stories like this one are the company you keep before sleep? Share it with us in the comments. We read every word with gratitude, and each one reminds us that even across miles, hearts can meet through shared stories. If this journey touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe, not only to hear more stories like mine, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, and in second chances. Because stories are not just told, they are carried, like lanterns passed from one hand to another, lighting the path forward. Thank you for giving your time, for listening, for allowing this chapter of my life to rest with you for a while. Wherever you are, in the hush of dawn or in the quiet hours of night, I hope you carry something from this story into your own life. And remember this: sometimes the miracle does not arrive with a loud knock at your door. Sometimes it waits, quietly, patiently, until you are ready to open your heart and let it in. Take care of yourself, and may peace walk beside you. Until we meet again in the next story, hold on to the truth that silence is not emptiness. Silence, when chosen, can be the purest form of strength.